If you've seen this channel before, you probably know that apart from having a general interest in film photography, so collecting cameras, taking photos, printing pictures and so on, I'm particularly interested in recreating and testing famous camera setups that appear in films and media. But a related interest I have is researching a camera setup used by a particular photographer, trying to replicate the setup, and then using it to take photos while trying to reproduce something of the look and style of the photographer's photos. And today I'll be talking about one of my favourite photographers, James Ravilious. I'll be replicating his setup and seeing if I can take some photos in his style. James Ravilious was born in Eastbourne, England in August 1939, son of Eric Ravilious, the painter, wood engraver and war artist. James studied art in London and then taught painting and drawing for some years. He married in 1970, moved to a cottage in Devon and had 2 children. Then, in the early 1970s, James took up photography, having been particularly inspired by an exhibition of photos by French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. Soon after this, the Arts Centre in the nearby village of Beeford invited him to contribute some work to the newly set up Beeford Archive, intended as a photographic record of life in the local area. What started as a short-term project, though, grew into a 17-year obsession. In that time, he produced over 80,000 images documenting all aspects of local life. Landscape, farming, everyday life in local towns and villages, and their special occasions. And speaking of his photos, I decided to visit the archives at the V&A in London to see in person some of the James Ravilious prints they have there. And looking at these photos, you can straight away split most of them into 2 categories. So firstly, there's his portraits of local people and their daily lives. And unlike some other documentarian photographers, like Cartier-Bresson for example, who took his photos anonymously as an external observer, Ravilious is much more a part of the scene, a part of the community, and this gives his photos a certain warmth. And then secondly, there's his landscapes. And one of the characteristics of Ravilious' landscapes is that very often you can discern the sun just outside the edges of the frame, or obscured by a tree or cloud. And this way of shooting gives his images a lot of drama and contrast, while maintaining a great deal of subtlety and nuance in the midtones. You can also see that objects in his photos have a slight glow effect or luminous quality about them, which is something I associate with very old lenses, and perhaps even lenses which have a bit of haze in them. And looking at his photos, I think you do feel a certain nostalgia for this way of life that has now more or less vanished from the earth. But I don't think his work ever feels overly sentimental or saccharine, which perhaps is a common pitfall when depicting life in old-fashioned rural England. Now, for a long time, I've been a fan of Ravilious' pictures, but what first inspired me to make this video was an image of James Ravilious' camera setup, which I came across while flicking through his biography, written by his wife, Robin Ravilious. So the camera is a Leica M3 from the 50s or 60s, with a pretty standard Summicron 35mm lens from the same period. And apparently he first chose to use an M3 because it was the camera used by Cartier-Bresson, who we've already mentioned. So that's all quite ordinary, but what really interested me were these 2 lenses on the left, which appear to be early Elmar lenses from the 1930s. And if we look at this lens, we can see it has a modified Leica hood from the 1950s attached to it, originally made for a completely different lens, a lens with a 90mm focal length. And the hood has a homemade mask on it made from tape, and this very odd homemade metal bracket on the side. And reading the biography, most of this is explained. So the reason for the 1930s lens is that after the 1940s, all Leitz lenses were coated lenses, like this 1950s Summicron, and the multicoloured sheen on the lens there shows that this lens is coated. Now, a lens coating is a chemical layer on the surface of a lens that serves to reduce flare and internal reflections between lens elements. Ravilious, however, found these lenses to be too contrasty and preferred the softer, lower contrast look of earlier uncoated lenses, like this 1930s Sumar. And quoting from the biography, it says, He, Ravilious, had begun to trawl through small advertisements and second-hand camera shops for pre-war lenses which didn't have the fluoride coating of their modern counterparts, so that their effect was softer. Some were too fuzzy, but others, such as the Hectors and Elmars, made by Leitz in the 20s and 30s, pleased him. though he sometimes had to improvise arrangements of his own in order to attach them to the M3 camera body by sacrilegiously filing bits off or bolting them on. And moving on to the reason for the unusual hood with the tape mask, Ravilious liked taking photos looking almost directly into the sun, and it was his modified hoods that allowed him to do this. Quoting again from the biography, "In order to make best use of these old lenses, he also created an eccentric adaptation for his lens hoods, using his old friend electrician's tape. He masked off the edges of the hoods to reduce their frames to fit the exact image areas of the lenses. This allowed him to shoot almost into the sun, as he loved to do, without losing too much detail in the dark areas, and without getting too much flare on his negatives. Now as for the last thing I mentioned, the strange metal bracket, I did work out what that was for, but it'll be easier to explain when I come to recreating it. And so now on to replicating this setup. And luckily I already have the main components that I need, so a Leica M3 from the late 1950s, and a very early Leica 1 from the mid-1920s, which has mounted to it the early 50mm Elmar lens that I need. And I can discard the parts I don't need, so the lens from the Leica M3 and the Leica 1 body. And one interesting thing about this Leica 1 is that it's so early, the lens originally would have been permanently attached to the camera, like you see on this unmodified Leica 1. You can see there the screws that hold the lens down. Then later on, sometime after 1930, the owner would have sent the camera and lens back to Leitz to have them both converted to M39 screw mount, which is what you see here, presumably so that the owner could use different lenses on the camera. But I do need to convert this M39 lens to Leica M mount, like the Leica M3, and I bought this simple M39 to M adapter for around £20, which I just screw onto the lens. And I can mount the lens onto the Leica M3. So that's the first part, and now onto the special hood. So I've tracked down the exact hood we see in the picture. It was originally intended for 90 and 135mm lenses, as I said before, and it only cost me around £10, as it is in pretty poor condition. And now the rest of what I need. So I have black card and tape to create the mask, and this old piece of Meccano to replicate the bracket on the side. And I'll now explain what the bracket actually does. And to demonstrate, I'll have to make a simple mock-up of the mask. And incidentally, I've already added this ring of rolled up paper to the back of the hood, which I painted black, which should make it fit on the much older lens. There was actually an official adapter made by Leitz, which is what Ravilious used to adapt the hood, and you can just about see it in the picture there. But it is quite expensive nowadays, and my paper adapter should work fine. And you can see it works. The hood fits onto the lens and stays in place. So that all seems fine. But when I try to focus the lens, you can start to see the problem. The hood, as you can see, rotates with the lens, which completely negates the point of the mask, which needs to be kept in its correct orientation to precisely mask the edges of the negative. If it moves around like this, it's worse than useless. And you can see that with this older type of Leitz lens, the whole thing rotates as you focus. And so what the bracket does is keep the hood in one orientation while the lens is free to rotate. And it is a bit tricky to demonstrate, but if you can imagine this metal piece is fixed to the hood here, and then fixed to the camera here, it should keep the hood in the right orientation while I focus. That's the theory anyway. Okay, so I'll now quickly make the mask for the hood. And I'll start by getting down the shape of the hood on a piece of black card. Now the opening in my mask is supposed to precisely match the edges of the image. So regular 35mm negatives are 24 by 36mm, which is a ratio of 2 to 3. And I'll have to replicate that ratio when I make the opening in the mask. So based on the diameter of my circle here, I've done some calculations to work out the largest rectangle with a 2 to 3 ratio that'll fit inside, from which I've made this template, and as you can see it fits in the circle perfectly. I can then draw around my template and cut everything out. And laying the pieces on the hood, you can see everything looks good. And then I can just use the black masking tape to stick them down. And I'll finally just add a strip of tape around the edge to make things look a bit neater. And that's now finished. And it's looking pretty good. Very similar to the one in the picture. So now on to making the metal bracket. I'll start by adding a 90-degree bend to my old piece of Meccano. And I'll now assemble some of the components just so I can work out where I want things to be. Now the distance between the hood and the camera is quite important. And I'm just following the picture as closely as I can to get it right. And I can mark where I want to cut the piece of Meccano. So after some cutting and filing, I now have a finished bracket. There is a reason for this curve here, which I'll get to in a minute. And I've also drilled a tiny hole here, which I'll use to fix the bracket to the lens. Now, James Ravilious used bolts to attach his bracket, but for me I think superglue should be sufficient. It's also reversible if I ever want to remove it. So I'm just gluing this end onto the hood, and I've added a little spacer there just to get the positioning right, which is just a tiny piece of wood I've painted black. And with that done, I can get onto the final assembly. Now this is a fairly rare, precious lens, and I don't really want to glue anything onto it, let alone drill holes in it. But luckily there is already a hole that I can use for mounting. So you can see this little post here, which acts as a stop to prevent you from unscrewing the lens completely as you focus. And I can just unscrew it, and I now have a mounting hole for the bracket. And looking closely at the photos, I believe this is actually exactly what Ravilious did. So I can put the hood in position now, lining up the two holes, and I happen to have lying around a screw with the right thread, I think M2, which I have filed to the right length. Now I know that one tiny screw isn't ideal, but all the bracket's doing is just keeping the hood in its orientation. Most of the weight of the hood is just held by the end of the lens, and if the hood ever gets badly knocked or anything, I'm hoping the glue connection will break, rather than this screw just getting pulled out. So that's now finished, and as you can see, as I focus the lens, it works very well. While the lens rotates, the hood is kept in one position. And you can now see why I shaped the end of the bracket like that, so that the lens is still able to rotate all the way clockwise to reach its infinity setting. And I'm just going to make sure that the hood is working as it should and not obscuring the image. So I've got the camera set up on a tripod with the shutter stuck open. And I have a piece of tracing paper that I'm sticking over the film plane. And you can see the image appear. And it doesn't look like the hood is obscuring any of the picture, so that's good. And if I carefully move my finger just barely beyond the edge of the hood, you can instantly see a shadow appear on the tracing paper, which means my hood is set up correctly and is just perfectly framing the image without obscuring it. And I've checked all four sides in the same way, and everything looks good. Now one final thing, you can see there's an external finder on Ravilious' camera. It's a lights universal finder which can be adjusted for any lens from 35 to 135mm. As I'm only using a 50mm lens though, this isn't really necessary, and I'm just going to add this 50mm finder, which I happen to have. And just for interest, that's the view through the regular M3 viewfinder, and that's the view through the external finder. It's not really necessary, it's just very slightly brighter and gives you a slightly wider field of view. But that's the whole setup now completed, and I think it looks pretty good. Just the combination of the hood that's worn from use and the parts that are clearly homemade, I just find it very aesthetically pleasing. So I'm now loading the camera with HP5 Plus, as HP5 was one of the films Ravilious used quite a lot, and I'm going to visit some English countryside now. And now that I've replicated his setup as closely as I can, and researched his shooting techniques, I'm going to try to take some photos in James Ravilious' style. So I'm going to take a minute now to talk about some of the photos I took. So first there's the hunt images, and I think a couple did turn out pretty well. And actually one of the reasons I chose this particular subject is that Ravilious back in the 80s took photos of a similar hunt in Devon. And here are some of those pictures. And for comparison, my image on the left and one of Ravilious's on the right. And then my landscape pictures. Again, I thought one or two came out pretty well. This was my favourite, I think. And I think shooting into the sun does just give photos a really nice effect. And for comparison, my image on the left and one of Ravilious's on the right. And although the point of the hood is to reduce flare, I did end up getting lens flare in quite a few photos, which I think is just a hazard when you're trying to shoot almost directly into the sun. On this image though, I think the flare works quite well and makes the image a bit more interesting. And finally, here's an indoor pic I took, which I quite like. You can see the slightly luminous quality which comes from the uncoated lens. And for comparison, my image on the left and one of Ravilious's on the right. Now, in the end, I only shot a few rolls of film, but I plan to keep shooting with this setup. And there are actually specific developing and darkroom techniques Ravilious used, which I didn't get around to trying, so perhaps I'll make a part 2 sometime. So that's about it for now. Let me know if there are any other photographers with particularly interesting setups that might be fun to replicate. Thanks for watching and see you next time.